What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from SBMTG on the YouTube.com. Down there, we like magic, and today I've got the first competitive deck tech of Amonkhet Standard Season, or at least the true Amonkhet Standard Season since Cat Combo got banned. Last time I did a budget deck, and I asked you what you'd want to see more. Either the resurgent green-black snake deck that people are trying to pick back up and play again, or something brand new, blue-white Approach of the Second Sun control. And your response was pretty much overwhelming. You almost all want to see the blue-white control deck. Now, in truth, this deck has seen more revisions than any deck that I've worked on this standard season so far, Cat Combo or not. We've done 4 or 5 decks so far, and this one I've probably ended up changing up to 10 or 12 times at this point, trying to get the numbers right and all. So this deck has seen an awful lot of work, and I like what we've arrived at here. So let's go ahead and get started by talking about the 3 copies of Approach of the Second Sun. Now, a tough question when building this deck is how many copies of Approach is correct. Some people want to play all 4 to increase their chances of just being able to cast Approach 2 turns in a row. That makes some sense. Some people just want to play 2 because, you know, all you need is 1 to win. So 2 seems like too much to some people. But I've decided to split the difference here because I do want the opportunity present to be able to just cast Approach twice in a row and win that way. But at the same time, I want to open up some slots for some other cards in the deck, and 4 seems like a little bit excessive to me. So I think 3 is correct. A couple of things about this card. First of all, a lot of people have already said this, but I just want to hammer it home. You do not have to resolve the first copy of Suns. You do have to resolve the second approach that you cast, but you don't have to resolve the first copy. It can get countered, totally fine. Second time you cast an Approach of the Second Sun, as long as you resolve it, you'll win the game. Now, the rest of the deck is more or less supplementary, you know. It's a traditional control deck. We'll play removals, we'll play counterspells, we'll play card advantage. We want to keep our hand up, and we want to keep stuff off the board. But before we get to that traditional control stuff, there are a couple of more cards in the deck that can not only end up winning us the game, I feel like we need a couple of more win conditions, but they're just super powerful pieces that also help to supplement Sun. So let's start with the 2 copies of Torrential Gearhulk here. That's right, just 2 copies, and I've seen some lists just running 1 copy of Torrential. There's a blue-white cycling control deck that plays like Curator of Mysteries as a 3 of, but it only plays 1 copy of Torrential, and I'm not sure how much I agree with that, but in this deck, 2 copies feels right, especially considering we're not playing as many instants as a lot of control decks will play. We're playing like enchantments in this deck, we're playing a planeswalker in this deck, you know, so it's just, we're playing Approach, that's a sorcery, so it's just not as easy to get something incredible to recast with a Torrential. But he can recast counter magic for us, he can recast at least 1 of our removal spells, so we got that going for us. But Torrential is also there to just win the game. Sometimes, you know, he's the only win condition in a lot of control decks. So sometimes he'll just come down, counter a spell, keep the board clean, and then swing in for 5 at a time, and eventually win you the game. Puts the opponent on a clock. That's kind of hard for them to deal with if they can't cast any spells. So just, I feel like it's important to have at least another win condition in the deck, and Torrential's probably the best one. But I've actually got 1 more win condition in the deck, and it is also sorcery speed. And it is a Planeswalker. Now, a lot of people may not agree with this because the control decks I've seen so far this season have not had any Planeswalkers, really. Like, some of them will play Chandra or Nahiri even out of the board. I've seen Jeskai decks do that. But a lot of them don't play Planeswalkers in the main deck. But in this deck, I felt like it was somewhat important to play 2 copies of Gideon of the Trials, and there's a lot of reasons. Now, the pros for including this are many, you know. First of all, his +1 just keeps something from doing damage to either him or us, which is really important, considering we're trying to draw the game out as much as possible, and he can just keep the hugest guy from dealing damage. That's pretty good, and you just keep ticking up the whole time, too. He's also a win condition. Just a 4-power dude that's indestructible and puts the opponent on a clock. Something else that's pretty good. We want that too. But in this deck, he also gives us a chance at getting an emblem that means we can't lose as long as he's out, which is really good when we're trying to cast Approach twice. But even if all he ever does is like prevent damage from the hugest guy a couple of times, get an emblem for a few turns, and then die, I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that because he's a great mechanism for stalling things, and occasionally he's a straight-up win condition, you know, in the later turns. When you have 6, 7, 8 mana, you can cast a Gideon and still have mana up for removal or counterspells or whatever you want to do. So there are sometimes in the later turns ways that you can go like Gideon and still have mana up for Torrential. So, like, and that really helps protect your Gideon right there. So just Gideon, I feel like he's worth playing a 2 of. And I'll end it there because I think that all the reasons for playing him are just, like, so obvious. Now, those are all the ways that we have of winning the game in the deck. Now, let's get on to the real control shell that we put around all of those cards here, starting with the removal. We'll play 10 different removal pieces in the deck, and white doesn't necessarily have the best removal in the world, but it did get a boost from Amonkhet because of Cast Out, which we're going to play 4 whole copies of. Now, when it comes to removing creatures, Cast Out is a little bit slow, but the flash helps an awful lot. But it's really the range of options that Cast Out has that makes it a good card here, you know. It can hit not only creatures, but planeswalkers, artifacts, enchantments, all kinds of stuff. Just any permanent type, except for lands, this thing can hit. And that means that it casts a really wide net, which is important right now, especially while everyone's brewing up different stuff. And in a pinch, can cycle. If you're playing against like another control deck that this isn't going to be great against, doesn't have a whole lot of targets, you know, this can cycle. Maybe you're mana screwed. This can cycle. Maybe you're digging for a counterspell really hard. This can cycle in that situation too. So just Cast Out does everything. Does everything. I'm also going to play 3 Fumigate in the main deck and 1 on the board to finish out the playset here. Because Fumigate's pretty darned important. There's a lot of creature-based decks in the format right now, and a sweeper is one of the most important things we can play, considering we're trying to get to a 7-mana card twice. So we definitely are going to have to sweep the board at some point. And Fumigate's the best thing at doing that in this color and these colors, because it also gives us some life back. We just gain 3 or 4 life off of a Fumigate. That's really awesome. I'm going to play 2 Immolating Glare in the deck, which doesn't seem like a whole lot, but especially in the early game, I don't really like the way that Immolating Glare plays alongside counterspells. You know, usually you'll have the choice at removing an attacking creature or countering a spell on their second main phase. And I don't like making that decision, although in the early game, usually you'll just take the damage. You take the damage, counter the spell, and then when it gets kind of serious, you'll start considering playing that Immolating Glare, or when you have more mana to both counter and glare in the same turn, you know. So Glare isn't necessarily amazing alongside counterspells, which is why there's not a bunch of copies of it in the deck, but it's still important to have a relatively cheap thing that takes out some of the most important attackers in the format. Now, our last piece of removal isn't necessarily just removal. It's got a lot of hats that it wears in the deck. We're going to play 1 copy of Commit to Memory here. Now, Commit to Memory is also removal that casts a fairly wide net. This is something else that can hit planeswalkers, which blue-white is a little weak to planeswalkers even with Cast Out. So having just another extra piece that can hit them is nice. And even though it only puts it 2 cards into their library, so they'll get it again, but that gives us a chance to be able to counter it when they do play it again. So in that way, Commit is nice, and it can hit creatures too that are a problem for us. So all of the ways that it is removal is nice, but there's a couple of different other tricks that we can play with Commit to Memory in the deck. The best one is being able to recast it with Torrential Gearhulk, and yes, that totally works. You can basically play a Gearhulk, target the Commit to Memory in your graveyard, and end up casting the memory half out of your graveyard for free with Torrential Gearhulk. You can do that. It's totally within the rules. Look it up. I had to. I wasn't even sure that was legal. I kept seeing it around, but I had to make sure it was. Turns out it totally is. You can recast a memory out of your graveyard with Torrential, and that is pretty cool, especially considering in this deck, you may sometimes want to roll the dice. You know, you cast an approach, you got that approach 7 cards down, but you want to win the game now. So there are times where you'll cast memory out of your graveyard, or you'll cast a Torrential to recast the memory, and just try and, you know, draw 7 fresh cards and get an approach somewhere in those 7 cards. That will happen. And the other trick here is that if you have all of the mana in the entire world, it's 11 mana to do this, but you could do it. You know, if you have all the mana in the world, the other trick is to cast Approach of the Second Sun the first time, and then just commit it. That's pretty great. It costs all of the mana, but, you know, you can do it. On to the counter magic here, one of the most important parts of a control deck, and it is like the bulk of the deck. We're playing 12 different counterspells in this thing because we're serious about our counterspells, and we're going to start with the talk of the town. We're going to play 4 copies of Censor. If you're still doubting that Censor is a good card, because there are some doubters out there, let me just point out that it is pentupled in price since it first came out. This was a 25-cent card. Now it'll cost you 5 times that to buy just 1 copy. And that's because everyone that has tested this says that it is the absolute gospel truth. And I am here to add my voice to that choir. It is fantastic, especially on the play against aggro. It's one of your best weapons. And all the way up to turn 4 or 5, this can still counter spells for you. And also, one of the best things about it is once your opponent knows or believes that you might be playing Censor, they will give you an extra turn for the entire game, which is something that this deck really, really wants. Also, when it does stop being a viable counterspell, you can always just cycle it for a mana. Drawing a card at instant speed, by the way, is something that control decks really, really want to be able to do, you know. But the fact that it can also counter spells in the first few turns, keep aggro off our back, keep mid-range from playing huge guys on turn 4 or 5, Censor is just freaking ridiculous. Yes, play it. I know a 2-mana Force Spike looks bad. This is maybe one of the top 5 cards in all of Amonkhet. It is that good. Sorry for yelling. I don't know how serious I got back there when I was talking about Censor, but I am that serious about Censor. Card is very good. Card is very good. It's good. So let's play some more Counterspells, though, and talk about those. We're going to play 4 total 3-mana Counterspells in the deck, and sometimes you'll see, 4 whole Disallow, but I've gone with 3 Disallow and 1 Void Shatter here because we absolutely hate, like most control decks, Scrap Heap Scrounger, and I want an extra option against that. But also Disallow can disallow Scrap Heap Scrounger's ability when it's trying to come out of the graveyard, so remember that too. That can also happen, but for the most part, I just want straight up insurance against Scrounger, so there's that. But Disallow will cover most of our bases. We're playing a playset of 3-mana Counterspells here that are just hard up, straight Counterspells, and that's what we want to do. We just want to be able to say no, and these cards do that with no strings attached. But that being said, I am going to play some Counterspells that are a little bit more narrow and also cheaper, because that is insanely important. So we're going to split a playset of 2-mana Counterspells here between the vastly different and more or less opposite Negate and Essence Scatter. We're going to play 2 of each of these. Well, this is pretty much the accepted split in a lot of control players' minds right now. Sometimes you'll see 1 Essence Scatter, but I think the format is shaping up to where we will see creatures relatively early in the game a lot of the time. So I think it's fine to go ahead and play 2 copies of Essence Scatter here. And Negate is just as good as it ever was. Even though Cat Combo is out, and it was a very, very important tool against Cat Combo, it is still important against all of the Planeswalkers that fill the void that Cat Combo once occupied. Marduk's going bigger right now, playing main deck Planeswalkers and stuff, and so this is still a very important card for us. We'll finish up the main deck here by talking about the card advantage suite that we're playing, starting with the 4 copies of Glimmer of Genius, which is one of the hardest decisions that I had to make building this deck, because for the longest time, I was on 3 Glimmer and 1 Hieroglyphic Illumination. Ultimately, I decided that Glimmer was just a better card here in this deck, because even though the energy doesn't actually do anything for us here, being able to see more cards and blow through a bunch of cards to get to approach after you've already cast it once is definitely more valuable in this deck than just being able to cycle for 1. And we've already got stuff that cycles for 1, which is pretty important, although I did like that Illumination could cycle early. You'll never cycle Censor early. You probably won't cycle Cast Out early unless you're playing against control, or unless you're land screwed, But Hieroglyphic Illumination felt relatively safe to cycle early. It feels like it's meant to cycle early. So I missed that about it. Glimmer you can't do that with, obviously, but Glimmer still lets you see the most cards. It lets you blow through cards to get to approach that second time, so Glimmer is just the better card, I'm afraid. And we'll finish off the main deck here with the 2 copies of Pull from Tomorrow, which is a great, amazing card. I won't really go ham on this like I did with Censor, because Censor, I believe, is the hype. That is the hope for control in this format. But if it's got a Scottie Pippen to its Michael Jordan, it's definitely this card. Best thing about Pull in this deck, or at least something that's very synergistic and worth mentioning, is that obviously you cast Approach, and then next turn, you'll cast this and dig like 6 or 7 cards in and either put that Approach into your hand or get really, really close to it. Just Pull from Tomorrow, if you'll pardon the pun, is the future. The card is really fantastic, and just like Censor, is something else that makes control truly viable in this format. Just don't pass the card by. It's probably going to go up in price, and it already has doubled in price just over the past couple of weeks because it's seen so much play during brewing season, and people are really opening their eyes to how amazing this card is. We're playing 26 lands in the deck here, and yeah, I'm not playing Aether Hub here. If we were 3 colors, I'd probably be on Aether Hub, but with just 2 colors, I would rather play, make room for basics, so make sure all of our duels come into play untapped as often as possible, So I just don't see the reason to play Aether Hubs. We're just 2 colors. We make our mana very consistently, We've got plenty of mana in the deck. We've got plenty of ways of making both colors. Very comfortable mana base here. But here is a sideboard, playing lots of 1s and 2s in this board here. We're going to play 1 copy of Dispel against Control, so we can have a very cheap way to get that second approach in. We're going to play another Negate just to have 3 copies. We're going to play another Essence Scatter just to have 3 copies. It's against certain decks, it's important to be able to shore up those numbers. Another Immolating Glare against Aggro, a Declaration in Stone mostly against Gods. That's where we're going to use that a lot of the time, but also against tokens builds and such. To Anticipate against Control, we want to be able to take out some of this removal but we want to have something to put in, so Anticipate is good for that. And it's also good for being able to blow through some cards to get to that second approach. That's important. 2 Stasis Snares is just a catch-all for good creatures at instant speed. A Summary Dismissal in there because I'm seeing a lot of Aetherworks Marvel decks playing Ulamog again, and it's important to have a Summary Dismissal against those Ulamogs. A Fumigate, a Fumigate to shore up the playset against aggro in there. 3 Forsake the Wordly. We get 3 whole copies of this deck in the sideboard against Mardu vehicles, because being able to not only exile Scrap Heap Scrounger is important, but also get rid of Heart of Kirin, and this works against Aetherworks as well. So this could almost deserve a main deck slot. Forsake is that good. And then Failure to Comply is in there because I feel like it's too gimmicky for the main deck, but against control decks, this can be a very, very good option. And here are your power rankings here. A final score of 65. I don't feel like this is the most powerful control deck in the format. I really like Jeskai Control that just wins off of Torrential Gearhulk and plays Planeswalkers in the sideboard. That deck looks really good. Grixis Control's looking okay right now too. But still, we've got a lot of good protective tools in this deck to get to that approach at least twice. So this deck does work. Had a fair amount of success with it, but I will still say if you're going to play control, there are probably better options, but those are more expensive options. Sure, we're playing a very expensive Planeswalker at a 2 of, and we're playing Torrential Gearhulk, which is a pretty expensive card too. But even after all of that, this deck is still far less expensive than some of the other control decks in the format, and way less expensive than all the mid-range like Mardu decks right now. You know, those decks are like $400. This deck is only about $150 on TCG Player right now. That is great for just a hard-line control deck that plays a lot of traditional pieces and wins the way a control deck does. And as a matter of fact, this deck has more win conditions than most control decks do. Most control decks will play a 3 or 4 of Torrential Gearhulk. That's their only way of winning the game. This deck has 7 different win conditions. That, 3 approach, 2 Gideons, 2 Gearhulks, so we've got a lot of angles of attack in the deck. We can kill him with our Planeswalker. We can, counter a spell at instant speed and have a 5/6 dude with Torrential Gearhulk. We can just cast Approach twice. We've got a lot of ways of winning and a lot of ways of keeping the board clean until we do it. I'm tapped out for now. That's all I've got to say about this one, but let me know how you feel about it down there in the comments section. Get in a couple of games with it and let me know how you did. I always like when you do that, but just let me know how you felt about what we could have done differently, all that, because I'm always interested, especially at the beginning of formats, to know what you guys would do differently. It's always good when we're still trying to tune decks to get a bunch of minds on it, get a whole community on it, because that's the way that decks get tuned the easiest. So, let me know how you'd change it down there in the comments. But what are we doing next time here? Well, Green-Black Snake is still in the mix, but I've got a caveat here. I can either do Green-Black Snake or, and I'll give you 3 decks here. I'll give you Green-Black Snake or Abzan Snake. I've been working on that too. Could do Abzan Snake. It's basically green-black, add white Snake. Or another brand new deck, and this one's a fan favorite, so I think I know which way it'll go here, but I'm not totally sure. I could also show you the Ramp deck, the deck that wants to play a huge Nissa Steward of the Elements and also plays like Walking Ballista and stuff. It'll play Cephet Monitor, like a bunch of new things, Deck looks really interesting, and I've been finagling with it for about a week now to some results. Still shoring it up, but I really want to bring that deck to you soon. So what do you want to see? You got Green-Black Snake, you got Abzan Snake, that seems weird, or you got the Nissa Ramp deck. Really interested in what you want to see here. So let me know down there in the comments, and I'm done for now. If you enjoyed the content, please like the content. Helps me so much. Just hit thumbs up. Sub if you're new. Hit the bell to get all the deck techs as they come out, because it's that time of the year. We'll be doing a bunch of deck techs in the coming weeks. You can also follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev. Share all my stuff there and send me presents. I'm Dev from SBMTG. Thanks for watching, my wizards.